This is the second special topic lecture in law, and I'll be handing over to Dr. Susan Drucker-Brown. I ought to issue a health warning for this lecture. That is to say, my views are rather personal and rather heartfelt on this subject, and you are obviously free to disagree with anything I say and to question anything I say. It is a subject which, that is to say, Inquisition, terror, torture, such matters are things which do stir our hearts, and I feel quite strongly about the subject, but I'll try and keep my lecture as even-handed as possible. The puzzles behind this lecture are: why do we not seem to learn much from history, long history of inquisitions? What has happened? The second is what has happened to the Enlightenment idea and the supposed secularization of the world, which was ridding us of demons and conspiracies and so on. The third is, why is it so easy and so widespread to destroy hard-won freedoms and to move towards a police state? And fourthly, to look at the hybridity, which I thought about in relation to Japan last time. This time the hybridity, or the coalescing between things we thought we had separated to a certain extent, that is politics, religion and law. I want to start with a brief history of moral panics, just to give you a framework. I'll start in 1486, when the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Evil, was written by two Dominican friars called Jacob Sprenger, that's S-P-R-E-N-G-E-R, and Henry Kramer, K-R-A-M-E-R, at the request of the Pope. This was a manual to deal with what was perceived as a rapidly growing threat of international terrorism, or at that time, heresy and witchcraft, the attempt of Satan and his minions, which is to subvert Christianity and civilization in the West. There began to be reports in Germany of a great threat to Christian civilization, a secret, widespread and ruthless conspiracy of heretics, or what we would now call terrorists, dedicated to overthrowing both the church and the state. The archfiend, or devil Satan himself, it was said, led this challenge. He recruited ordinary men and women to become his servants, using a diabolical ritual compact to seal their allegiance. Vague details of this plot were only just beginning to emerge, and even vaguer were the methods to combat this new threat. So the two Dominican friars were instructed to gather all the previous precedents and to provide a working manual for the authorities. Drawing on detailed earlier descriptions of hunting down and destroying Jews and heretics, they wrote a long and systematic account of how to deal with the new threat, the Hammer of Evil. It was a long and detailed work containing many practical bits of advice. Just to single out one in the third part, question 15, it was mainly in the form of questions which people were to put to suspected witches and their friends. It was concerned with, I quote, of the continuing of the torture and of the devices and signs by which the judge can recognize a witch, and how he ought to protect himself from their spells. Also how they are to be shaved in those parts where they used to conceal the devil's marks and tokens, together with the Jews setting forth the various means of overcoming their obstinacy in keeping silence and refusal to confess. I'll come back to this. Assuming that there was a great moral threat, the reality of the devil and the witches and the counteractions against them, including the use of judicial torture and circumstantial evidence and lying, was considered to be justifiable. The ends, that is, extirpating Christianity in the Western world of this terrible threat, would justify all means, more or less. Now, one of the interesting things is that because this book was published towards the end of the 15th century, we can now look at it historically and look at what happened as a great part as a result of this single manual. This was, in fact, an enormous crusade, internal crusade within Europe against the witches in Italy, Spain, Portugal, Germany and France. Many tens of thousands of people were tried for the offence of witchcraft, tortured and executed. Families and communities were torn apart. The numbers go up into the hundreds of thousands. A campaign of terror was launched by the authorities, and they warned their populations to be terrified, vengeful and suspicious. Danger lurked all around people. Those who questioned the actions of the authorities were themselves often accused of being in league with the devil and tried as accomplices of the witches. Yet, despite all this huge effort, disappointingly, the more witches were weeded out, the more they seemed to spread. It seemed almost like pruning. You cut them back and then more and more sprouted. It seemed in the end a war that could not be won, but could only be endless and go on. This went on for several hundred years, but finally from the middle of the 17th century, a combination of factors which are not really entirely understood led to the questioning of the whole approach. People started to ask the undermining question, really, are there witches at all? They also asked whether it was the very methods used to fight the witches which created the enemies in the first place. A wonderful text in this field is someone called Reginald Scott, double T, The Discovery of Witchcraft. He was a Kentish justice of the peace in the late Elizabethan period, who, as a Protestant, undermined most of the methods that were being used against witchcraft and said the whole thing was an illusion created by the judicial machinery to crush it. As this skepticism grew, fueled by things like advances in scientific knowledge and an attack on religious dogmatism, the fear of witchcraft, and hence the supposed witches, suddenly melted away. It happened quite quickly in most parts of Europe in the later part of the 17th and in the 18th century. You find traces of it in the great etchings and drawings of Goya, of course, in Spain, his satirical attack on this kind of belief. But over much of Europe the witch trials declined, and the odd conclusion was the less you fought against witches, the less witches there seemed to be, and the realization became apparent that it was something that had been entirely created by human imagination and the machinery which had been set up to deal with witches. Just one example, because it's a very nice example, of the kind of quick undermining of a moral panic like this, which can take place, is a book by Gustav Henningsen, which should be on the reading list, which has an interesting history, because I lent it to Jean Lafontaine, who then looked into satanic child abuse, and it helped her to see that that was also a fabrication. But The Witch's Advocate by Henningsen is a study of the Basque witch trials in the 1620s. A whole lot of people were discovered thought to be witches, and a major anti-witchcraft inquisition was initiated. Thousands of women were in prison. Children witnessed that they had seen their mother flying off in the night through the keyhole in the door, dancing naked in the company of Satan on the top of the mountains, engaging in vile sexual and cannibalistic acts. Yet after a while there were three inquisitors involved, and the youngest of the three began to suspect that this was an entire fabrication. So he did some tests. He hid spies to see if the women really danced at their favourite spots. He went out to the place where they said they were dancing naked and having sexual acts. And next morning he'd go back and he said, I was there where you were supposed to be dancing, and you weren't there. He put glass bottles over the keyholes to see if trapped small witches were caught in these glass bottles. he analysed the grease which they rubbed on themselves to make them fly and found that it was soot and pig's fat. So he said to them, look, you weren't doing these things. These things don't work. Why did you do this? And they said, well, we lied to try and protect ourselves. And the children who had lied against their parents also said, well, no, we made it all up. It was just under the pressure of the fear of torture and death. We made it all up. And all the trials ended and all the people were sent home to their houses. Now, that's a very long-term and interesting example, because there's absolutely, as far as we think nowadays, no foundation to it. Hundreds of thousands of people killed for no deep foundation. Other trials which have been likened to this are more difficult in a sense, and it's the same with the case of terrorism, which I'll come on to later, because there obviously is something there. There are terrorists, there are people who try and bomb, there are Jews, though what they do is another matter, there are communists, and there are people who abuse their children, probably not in satanic rituals, but who do this. So in those cases, it's always possible to find one or two cases, and you can't wipe away the whole thing. But the early witchcraft trials are an example of how great a fear and panic you can build up on the basis of absolutely nothing. So imagine what you can do if there really is something there to be frightened about. So I'll just remind you as I pass through, there's Hitler's obsession with the Jewish conspiracy, partly based on the forged protocols of the Elders of Zion. If you're interested in that and in the whole subject, there's a very good historical overview by a man called Norman Cohn, I hope it's on the reading list, called Europe's Inner Demons. And Norman Cohn worked first on the millennium, and then he worked on these kinds of obsessions with inner demons within European psychology, and he's a very good historian, and obviously Jewish and stuff. Just passionate and interested in this. So there's the Jewish conspiracy, which has gone backwards and forwards through history. A more recent one are the McCarthy anti-communist trials in America, the Committee on Un-American Activities by McCarthy. And that led to similar witch find hunting techniques to round up suspected secret agents of communism. A number of anthropologists were involved in this. Owen Lattimore, he wasn't exactly an anthropologist, but he was a great explorer of inner Asia, was summoned and his career nearly ruined. And he wrote a book about this because of these McCarthy trials. There was just denunciation, spying, sowing fear and suspicion, and of course recently there's been this nice film, George Clooney. If any of you want to see this in action, then see George Clooney's film Goodbye and Good Luck, Good Night and Good Luck, which is a rather nice short film on the subject. Anyway, people stood up, as Clooney's film portrays, against these activities, and the whole thing faded very quickly. Someone stood up to McCarthy, several people. The first people who did obviously ended up as proto-communists, but at a moment it tipped, and he was disgraced. And people were no longer in fear and committing suicide and so on, as happened in that period in the 60s, 50s, 60s. But there have been more recent ones. There were several in this country in 80s, 90s, particularly a very famous one in the Scottish island of Orkney, and another one in the Lancashire town of Bolton. In these, suddenly the police swooped down, arrested a number of people, threw them into jail. Some of them, most of them had their children taken away, sometimes 10, 15 years. And they were accused of many of the things that these medieval witches were accused of. In Bolton, for instance, there was a film about this where they re-looked at the evidence. And the social workers went to the local authorities and said, ordinary members of your town going into the churchyard, sacrificing animals, having sexual intercourse with their children, very young children, and so on. And there was a rather nice remark by some Bolton elder who said, you know, it all seemed a bit strange, you know, I'd never heard of anything like that happening in Bolton before, or words to that effect. I mean, but, you know, these were professional sexual workers. They were using techniques of psychology like repressed memory syndrome, people under questioning. The film of, luckily they kept the films of the actual questioning, and you could see the leading questions that were being used. There was a very graphic case that I remember now of a little boy who had first been diagnosed as odd because in class he used to hide under the table. So they started questioning him, and he said, it's because I have nightmares at home. And then they said, what sort of nightmares? And they said, well, I see these sort of white figures. And they said, well, tell us more. And he said, well, they're just white figures. And they said, well, did they touch you? He said, well, sometimes they punched me on the tummy. Are you sure it was the tummy? Wasn't it a bit lower down? And so on. In the end, they arrested the parents and separated the families and so on. And you get all these other pseudo-psychological things like Munchausen syndrome by proxy. In other words, you kill people, suffocate your children, and so on. The premise is that this world, this terrible world of abuse and satanic meetings and so on, exists, and then you go out and find it, and it's extremely difficult once the process has got started to stop it, especially if you aren't very vigilant with your investigation methods. If you're interested in that, then the book I mentioned by Jean Lafontaine, Speak of the Devil, she was asked by the government to set up a commission to look into cases of child abuse, and she is an anthropologist who worked in East Africa and elsewhere, a very distinguished anthropologist, and she found that the whole thing, almost all the child abuse cases, and certainly all the satanic ones, were made up, created by the legal machinery to deal with them, the social work machinery. And thousands were later released without any guilt being proven, though their families had often been destroyed, people committed suicide, they lost their children, and so on. Now, how does this happen? How do these big panics occur? And I want to now look at the legal machinery, since this is a lecture in relation to law. What happens is that a number of people think there is an entirely new, an unprecedented and huge threat to our way of life. It's new, it's secret, it's highly camouflaged, and we have to fight against this moral threat. So in order to do that, first of all, you have to find the people who constitute this enemy that you're fighting against. And you here use the well-known technique of criminal profiling. You find a kind of average of what these people are like, and then you go around looking for such people. This is necessary because the enemies are so secretive and can work at a distance, sending anthrax through the post, or in the case of witches, bewitching over distances and so on. They can corrupt computer systems in cyberspace. So in order to eradicate them, you're not dealing with ordinary criminals, and that was the case with witches. They are people who are more or less invisible. But there are signs that you can build up an identity kit of what they're like. In the 15th century, in the Malleus and other books, you had a set of criterion by which you could tell a witch. You could tell them by their looks. They were usually old women, ugly, poor, etc., etc. And nowadays, as we know, the criminal profiling in relation to terrorists means that you start with suspicion of people with rather swarthy skins, with beards, Middle Eastern accents, eating certain things, and so on. I mean, they're more likely to be your terrorists than other people. You may think I'm exaggerating here, but for instance, they run courses, or they used to run courses, I don't know if they still do them, for long-distance truck drivers in America to recognize tourists. It was thought that as they went around a lot, they could see tourists at a distance. And the course mainly consisted of telling them that if they were driving around down the road and they saw someone of Middle Eastern physiognomy, then they should particularly pay their attention to them, and if they were doing anything that looked in the vaguest bit suspicious, they should attack them. After 9/11, there were these famous cases. One that particularly sticks in my mind. You start with a profile and know that this Middle Eastern person is living in your city. And in this case, this Middle Eastern person's house was raided, and they found two definite bits of evidence on which he was jailed for 6 months or a year. The first was that he had a photograph out of his bedroom window of a tree in his garden. This was evidence that the tree was the place where he would sit with a rifle and shoot people as they came down the road. I think this is in one of Moore's films. The second was that he had a video of a visit with his family to Disneyland, and in one of the bits of the video which they showed, he panned across, and for about 2 seconds he caught a rubbish bin in the corner of the Disney thing, and this was evidence that he was using this device to find out where the rubbish bins were so he could put bombs in them. He was in prison for 6 months or a year for that. But there are many other checks. For instance, you see what people read. All loans from public libraries in the United States are indexed, and the FBI has access to all of them. It's probably the case here now. Almost all credit and bank accounts are accessible to central agencies here and in America and elsewhere. Those who make frequent phone calls to their relatives and friends in such countries are suspect. I was somewhat worried the other day when I lost my mobile phone. It was stolen, and within a very short time, the person who picked it up on the station had made 30 or 40 calls to Georgia in the Soviet Union. Now, I've been unfortunate enough to be picked up for that. What would I have said? Well, someone else stole my phone. Oh yes, tell us another one. Anyway, so the profiling gives you a prima facie case, and then you add to that the watching people, infiltrating the population. With the Inquisition, you had professional spies placed in the population all over Spain and Italy and so on, who were just watching to see if there were terrorists. Inquisitors dressed as ordinary citizens, and they also bribed informants. And another method at that time was to provide a box into which someone could make an accusation and inform on their neighbours. I don't know that it's yet happened, but it would be very easy to set up an anonymous website to which you could report people, and certainly or sometimes encourage phoning with information. One of the tricks here is that those who make anonymous accusations against suspected heretics must be protected, and in the Inquisition trials they were protected by giving them an anonymous cover, so that if you look at the portraits of the Inquisition trials, you'll see of someone coming in with a mask, disguises his voice, he makes the accusation. The person he's accused never knows who he is, can't speak a word. It was realized that you might get accusations out of pure malice, but it was accepted that this was just one of the costs of this approach. A second very important method which is used in all these kinds of situations is widening the net through inter-accusation, the network approach. I had a friend who made films about the disappeared, television films about the disappeared Chile and elsewhere, and he said he'd been through the files, and this was one of the favourite methods used by Pinochet and others. Basically what you do is you locate one person who's a likely suspect, a witch, a heretic, a terrorist, And then you use strong pressure to make them accuse other people. And network analysis, of course, shows that very quickly you get a large number of people. The title of the anthropologist Barthelon's book on Malta is Friends of Friends, and that was because the whole of the Maltese population, 80,000 people, are friends of friends. You only have to go back to 3 or 4 orders of friendship to cover a very big country. And so if you can get people to start saying, well, so-and-so's in my coven, so-and-so's in my group, then you pull in people very quickly. In the case of the witches, there were all the various techniques that were used. People would be deprived of sleep for long periods, told that they would be burnt unless they confessed, suspended with heavy weights attached to their feet, or put on a rack and their joints slowly broken apart. Nowadays, the Americans and no doubt the British use fairly similar techniques, but not quite as crude. The secret now is to use methods which don't leave scars on the body when the person is released, so that they can be photographed and some fuss created. So a person is immersed in freezing water or left naked in an icy wind, subjected to intense white noise, that is a very, very high-pitched sound, deprived of sleep and half-starved, forced to crouch or lie in intensely painful positions for many hours, and one of the worst and most effective ones, which you probably know of, waterboarding, where you put on a board like this, and it's tipped and your head is under water in a bucket. And this appears to be a very deep psychological reaction of a human being that they can't stand this for very long. People who have withstood all these other kinds of sleep deprivation and so on usually crack within about 30 or 40 seconds. This is the thing which, for the last 4 years or so, the Americans, not all the Americans of course, but the President and Cheney and others have been ambivalent about whether this is torture or not. Now you may think this is just extreme lunatics who think that we should use such methods nowadays. But I was very surprised and shocked in a way to discover in the work of John Gray, who some of you may know. He's an LSE professor of politics, and he wrote Straw Dogs and other books, and he's written a lot about this subject. If you look him up, you'll see his works. But he writes, I met him, and he wrote a satirical article for the New Yorker or something, which was based on Swift's famous article. It was a modest plea for torture. He said, never do that again, never do that, Alan, because my friends rang me up and disowned me. They thought I was serious. Because what he did was to put forward the argument that terrorists and others should be tortured. Now he did this partly because it was a satire on an American lawyer at Harvard, I think, or maybe Yale, Alan Dershowitz. Have any of you heard of Alan Dershowitz? Who argues that since we're going to have to torture these people anyway, then we ought to do it properly. Firstly, we ought to issue licenses to judges to torture people rather than just falling into it. Secondly, the method should be reasonable, like putting sharp needles under people's fingernails. It's the one that he recommends. His argument is quite simple, and he puts it to his students. He says, look, supposing the utilitarian, it's the narrow utilitarian argument. Basically, if there are 10 people who are going to be killed probably by a probable bomb somewhere, isn't it better that you use torture on one person? You weigh the good of one individual against 10. And most of his students say, no, it isn't better. And he said, okay, let's make it 100. No, it's still not worth it. Let's make it jump a few stages. Let's make it a million people. You know that there's a dirty bomb suspended, probably, you never dirty bomb there, and there's one person, if you torture them, they tell you where it was, and you might save 1 million people. On utilitarian grounds, you should torture them. Now, the answer to this, of course, is that you move from particular utilitarianism to general utilitarianism. You don't just look at that situation, you think of the ongoing effects of the leading democracies of the world blatantly using torture. And you may lose 1 million people, but if you use torture in these cases, you may lose the whole political, legal, judicial civilization which you're meant to be fighting for. Anyway, he doesn't very much weight on that, and he assumes that it is reasonable in certain circumstances to use judicial torture. If you use such kinds of pressure and torture, then you very quickly get the names of accomplices, and these are measures which were used by Chairman Mao in China, Stalin in Russia, Pol Pot in Cambodia, they disappeared in Chile or Argentina, but now used indirectly in Guantanamo Bay, also indirectly owned by the British rendering people to foreign lands. The whole thing is changing all the time, so some of this is not entirely current, but it's still being debated. And this leads to the uncovering of whole networks of new suspects. It's combined with using evidence from people who you wouldn't normally allow. For instance, in the witchcraft cases, because it was so difficult to prove, you would allow husbands to accuse their wives and vice versa, which wasn't allowed in common law normally. Young children were allowed to witness against their parents, close relatives, and so on. And it was often found, as in the famous witchcraft trials in Salem, Massachusetts, at the end of the 17th century, that children were the best witnesses against their parents. And this is now, this was what was used in many of these child abuse cases. You really didn't have anyone else except the child who, under a little bit of coaching, could be persuaded to say that their parents had abused them sexually in various ways. I always give you a break after about 40 minutes, 35 minutes, as you know. This is rather depressing stuff, so perhaps you need a bit of a break. But if there are any questions that you'd like to ask me of a specific kind, have any of you been tortured? Perhaps you wouldn't say in public, because you have. I never have, except at my boarding schools in various unpleasant ways, but that was more psychological than physical. Other methods. The use of false confessions. This was particularly important over much of Europe and Soviet Union and so on, because under Roman law, you can't execute a person until they have confessed. This is meant to be a protection for them. But, of course, the effect is that you force them to confess. Even Stalin couldn't execute someone until he had a signed confession. So the guns, the temples, and the various types of torture that were used were to force a person to confess. If you want to see the kind of punishment and confession side of it, then if you look at Foucault's Discipline and Punishment, particularly the first few pages, you'll see that the world of 18th century France and so on. So basically, that's one of the reasons why you have this kind of torture. Secondly, you need circumstantial evidence. You can't get direct evidence from any of these things. So you use as much pain, anxiety, worry on the person without actually killing them, to try and get them to implicate others and confess themselves. This is particularly necessary, as those early inquisitors pointed out, because people who are part of this conspiracy, there's a sort of catch-22. They themselves are fortified by the devil. They will endure terrible punishments and torture because the devil has made them strong, and you can sometimes get them to say that. And the same sort of thing I've heard said about prisoners in Guantanamo. They refuse to confess because their Islamic faith is so strong, and this is just confirmation of their evil tendencies. If you've seen some of the people who in those situations, they are often extremely dignified and they have undergone appalling treatment. But this just aggravates the crime to a certain extent. Of course, you start with the assumption that the people you're going to torture and get confessions from are guilty, and this is why it was interesting that the President of the United States stated before the Guantanamo any sort of trial at all began was that all of those there were terrorist prisoners and evil people who needed to be there before any kind of trial. So their guilt is evident, but you need to try and press it out of them. If you can't do it in your own country, of course, because there are laws against torture, for instance, in this country and in the United States, and that's why we put them in Guantanamo. Here you send the man from America to places in the world where torture is common, many parts of the world. So you have what's known as rendition, or extraordinary rendition, sending them, and many flights came through through this country and were known by this government, obviously, were being sent on to be tortured in various places. It's not a very easy area, because when a big case was taken to the Court of Appeal in this country, the Court of Appeal judges ruled that while torture is not legal in Britain, evidence arising from torture elsewhere is admissible in the British legal system, as long as the torturing is being done by someone else. That held for a little while, but was overturned, I'm proud to say, by someone who was at school with me, or was just 2 or 3 years ahead of me, Lord Bingham, Lord Chief Justice, and other law lords overthrew this ruling, and they said that torture is not to be used in evidence wherever it has come from. But one doesn't know what actually still happens. Further devices are that show the difference between the common law tradition of Anglo-American society and Roman law. In English law, a person is deemed to be innocent until proved guilty, but in the premise of many of these panics is the other way around. They are guilty until they can prove themselves innocent, and that is extremely difficult to do. Another safeguard for the citizen in common law societies is that you have to have a trained lawyer defending you. You have to have a writ stating what your offence is within a very reasonable time, and for almost 99% of English history, this was within a few days, or a day or two, 24 hours or 48 hours. The case should be tried in open court to prevent all this secret witnessing and secret dealing going on, so that justice also could be seen to be done. The trouble with terrorist trials is that because you're supposedly dealing with such a large threat, all these things are waved aside. You won't have civil lawyers defending you in all cases. Cases probably won't be tried in open court. And above all, you won't be tried by a jury certainly in the Guantanamo military tribunals that they're trying to set up. Jury, which I'll come back to in my subsequent lectures, are a terribly important bulwark or break between the state and the individual, because you have to persuade people who are not in fear of their lives or death or under any pressure that someone is guilty, and they make judgment. If you don't have that, as in the famous Diplock trials, which was such a disaster in Northern Ireland, you just have judges, then the citizen is just facing confrontation with the state, and this was the case in the Inquisition trials. In the portraits you just see 2 or 3 inquisitors and the accused. No one else has to be persuaded. This is the most important of all safeguards the liberty of the individual. If this interests you, then the interesting book by Helena Kennedy, which she's on the reading list. Joss Law, she's a senior lawyer, and she's written about the threat of abolishing juries in various kinds of case. The result of all this is that, and this was one of the questions I raised at the beginning, it's very easy, we live through this now, and I lived through it over the last few years, it's very easy to see how a great moral panic of some kind or other very quickly changes the whole judicial system. And so many of the checks and balances are pushed aside. Something that took hundreds of years, like habeas corpus or whatever, can be brushed away in a matter of months. Half a millennium of legal safeguards. A particularly famous example is after 9/11, the passing of the Patriot Act, in which brought in all sorts of new legal measures which went against the American Constitution, against American judicial safeguards. This Patriot Act was a huge act. It was a printed paper like this. And the members of the Congress that voted on it were given this pile of paper the evening before they had to vote on it. And I think with one exception, they all voted for it. They had no idea what was in it. Well, they might have rough ideas. This is the kind of panic legislation you can get through very quickly. And the justification is that we are at war. We're not in a legal situation. We are in a battle. We are fighting in the Second World War. We are fighting for our lives against an enemy. And so we have to rush things through. And we are also facing people who are so devious and dangerous that we can't wait for them to strike. Now, one of the pillars of Anglo-American justice has been that you try people for offences. You don't try them for their state of mind. You don't preemptively guess at what people are going to do. But in such a situation as this, if you think that there's a possibility or a likelihood that someone might go out and plant a bomb, etc., or bewitch people, then you should strike preemptively. The first cases based on this are coming to light now. There was one recently of a Muslim woman who had various manuals and maybe even bits of chemistry equipment in her flat. I mean, it wasn't clear what she was going to do with this, but they were they seemed to point to a prima facie case that this person was up to no good, and she was imprisoned for a long period, as I recall. This is a new and powerful doctrine of preemptive strike against people on the basis of suspicion that they may get up to no good in the future. They are suspected. Another doctrine which is now unrolling itself is what you might call the doctrine of it probably won't happen, but let's ensure that it never does happen. The case the dispute that's now going on with the publication of the new Act, Prevention of Terrorism Act by the Home Secretary, her grounds are that, okay, so the Attorney General, the Lord Chief Justice, everyone is against in raising the number of days that a person should be in prison before the case is, before they're accused of something, from 32 or if it is 48 or that sort of thing. No one thinks it's necessary at the moment, but suppose it might be necessary in the future. Supposing in 3 or 4 years suddenly something happens. Now that kind of argument is like Dershowitz argument, very difficult to counter if you just face it. You think, well, yes, something might happen, you might need this power. But if you think for a moment the extensions of that, it's part of the sort of risk avoidance tendency in our society. Because with that argument, you can prove that you can do anything. I mean, you should lock up anyone suspected of any possible crime, because they might possibly do this. Or you should, why stop at 48 days? I mean, there might be situations where you need 100 days or 200 days or a year. Of course there might, but you have to balance probabilities, and you also have to take into account all the loss to a society where you erode the basic rights of individuals and the background of habeas corpus and so on. There is a cost to raising this, which is not considered. So basically, these are the kinds of arguments. Now, just to conclude, one of the sadnesses to me is that many people who are acting in this field know very little about history and haven't looked at these earlier cases, which are not the same, but they give you clues about the dangers that we face. Witches did not exist. Jews and communists certainly did, and terrorists do as well. But you can see how very easy it is to inflate a panic into something. The other thing to consider is what are the reasons behind this phenomenon. And there are reasons at all sorts of levels. There's a deep reason, which I think is, you can only really see if you go to Japan or China and look back on the West, and that is the legacy of monotheistic Western religions. This isn't confined to Christianity or Islam or Judaism. They are based on the premise of a world, of a sort of Manichaean world, that is, a world divided between God and the devil. And in such a world, which may have formerly been partly ameliorated, we are on the side of God and they are on the side of the devil. It's a binary black and white world, which you can see deep in almost every speech on the subject by political leaders after 9/11. So that binary, which you don't find in Chinese and Japanese religion, means that when I talk to my friends in China and Japan, they are amazed. They say, we cannot understand this feud between two monotheistic religions, Islam and Christianity and so on, and why they're in such a fear and panic about these things. The second background is the effects of being in a state of war. I believe, fortunately, the British government has stopped using the term war on terror, but it's very near to the surface. And of course, if you have something like the axis of evil with a capital E, and you have a war against it, it then justifies anything. That's what wars do, as in the Second World War, herding up suspects and so on. Now, in previous wars, you had a war that started on a certain day and that could end on a certain day. If you have a war against terror or a war against evil, it never ends. Direct George Orwell. It's 1984. It's an endless war which justifies more and more severe and draconian measures against it. And war, as Montesquieu, as Tocqueville, as all the great political philosophers pointed out, is the quickest way to ruin and undermine liberty and equality before the law. It always has done, it always will do. So as long as we go on talking in those terms and pretending we are fighting a war which we can win against a nebulous enemy, you're going to get this process. It's a war that has all the hallmarks of the previous one, so against an unsleeping, invisible, dangerous, undermining kind of enemy, which is trying to sap our way of life, and will use any kinds of weapons, which is used weapons of mass destruction like earthquakes and plagues and so on, and poisoning wells, and our enemies will use weapons of mass destruction against us. And there can be no truce or termination to such a war if it's believed to exist. For evil is hydra-headed, and if you cut it down here, it will come up there. We're told that terrorism feeds on envy, and the envy of poor immigrants, of poor people in the third world. But instead of doing what you would think you would do, is to try and reduce the envy by making their lives a little more pleasant and showing some sympathy and interest in it. You just try and crush it and say, well, they're envious of us, they're trying to understand destroy our world, let's fight them. Of course, as I want to end, there are differences between some of the earlier panics and the present one. Witches, we know, could not actually harm people. A bomb delivered by whichever side in the battle kills and maims. The main point, however, is to realize that from past experience, it's very easy to get into an almost unending, vicious cycle of fear. There's a very good set of films by Adam Curtis called The Power of Nightmares, which explores this. The mutual fear that went between Islam and America and the build-up to 9/11, he explored it in these films. You can get into this vicious cycle of fear leading to more fear, leading to more punishment. And I think one could do well to remember a line from poet Edwin Muir. We have seen good men made evil, wrangling with the evil. Straight minds grown crooked, fighting crooked minds. You become infested with this stuff, and that's why I think my friends advise that I put myself well out of the reach of the general population on the internet, because I found myself becoming terrified, fearful, angry, bitter, fighting with people who were fighting it. So beware of all this, but I think it's important to realize these pressures. And I'm glad to say that I will be retiring before I am forced to do MI5 or MI6 training in trying to spot terrorists, which would require me, if I saw one of you acting in a suspicious way at my lecture, to report you to the authorities. But you can be assured I'm not going to do that, A, because I wouldn't recognize it, B, because it would be against my principles. So thank you very much for coming to my 2 lectures, and I will be seeing you for 2 more of a bread and butter kind in the second half of the term. Thank you very much. If anything, as they say in BBC programs, has disturbed you in any way of what I've said, you'll send me an email. We'll chat about it. Okay.